Hello, I'm Mark Payne of the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Live. History Live is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of community groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the Council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Live presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It's an audience development or an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own question of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we'll change the format a little bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give you a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio today, Martin Delany.
During this week of April the 14th, 1865, some amazing events have occurred. Our nation has been transformed from one of a divided nation to a unified nation, to one of a land of slaves, to a nation where all men and women are free. And because of these great events, my mind has been reflecting back on some things that have occurred during my lifetime as I struggled to gain freedom and respect for the black man here in the United States of America. Oh yes, I remember that day in September of 1850. President Millard Fillmore had signed into law the unrighteous Fugitive Slave Law. This new Fugitive Slave Law said any white man from anywhere in the country could go anywhere in this nation, north or south, east or west, and proclaim you, a black man or woman, were his slave. And you had no rights to defend yourself. You may have been born free, had the papers and documentation to prove your freedom, but you did not even have the right to go through the court system and prove it. And so many communities throughout the country had protests and meetings against this law. And our community of Pittsburgh was one of them. And I remember after the mayor and a few dignitaries speaking, I rose and said, "Honorable Mayor, whatever ideas of liberty I may have, I learned from your revolutionary fathers. And what I learned from them is a man's home is his castle. And a man has a right to defend that castle even unto the taking of a life. In my home are none other than my wife and children, as free as the birds of heaven. If someone crosses my threshold in search of a fugitive slave, I care not who he may be, whether he be magistrate or constable or the one who signed this unrighteous ruling into law, surrounded by his cabinet as his banner and the Declaration of Independence as his flag. If he crosses my threshold in search of a fugitive slave, and I do not lay him a restless corpse at my feet, may the grave refuse my body a resting place, and righteous heaven my soul a home. No, he cannot enter my house, and we both live. And now, looking back on those days when slavery seemed to be entrenched in our nation, but after Congress had solidified slavery with the Fugitive Slave Law, the Supreme Court went and kept that ruling further, but the Dred Scott decision saying no Negro had any rights in which a white man was bound to respect. In those days, the quest for freedom seemed almost hopeless. But now look, some years later, in 1861, Fort Sumter, right here where we are in Charleston, South Carolina, was fired upon as General Beauregard ordered his artillery to fire on the fort. Major Robert Anderson of the Union forces, being outmanned, was forced to surrender, and the shot-torn American flag was taken down. But now, here we are, right here in Charleston, celebrating the victory, sailing out to the harbor for the restoration of the flag over Fort Sumter, celebrating the unifying of our country once again, and the end to slavery. Joining us on this righteous occasion was the eloquent George Thompson, who came all the way from England. Wendell Phillips, oh yes, and the immortal one, William Lloyd Garrison. As the ship sailed out to the harbor, my commanding officer, General Rufus P. Saxton, said a few words. Then there was a cry for me to speak. The Black Major, Martin Robertson Delany, commanding officer of the United States 104th Colored Troops. And after I spoke, the immortal one rose. As William Lloyd Garrison stood there, I thought about him in the early years, declaring, no matter where I am, whether in the east, or the west, or the north, or the south, my voice will be heard on behalf of the perishing slave. And then I remember the Garrison being accosted by a mob with a lyncher's rope around his neck, only being saved when the sheriff rescued him from the mob and threw him on the jailhouse floor, locking the gate. And Garrison said, never before has a man been so happy to be in jail. And now here he is giving his final advice to the newly freedmen. And he said this, I have always been an advocate of nonviolent resistance. But this much I say to you, whatever you do, die first, but never again do you be slaves. After Garrison finished speaking and the band struck up once more in patriotic frames, the ship began to sail away from the harbor, and we all looked back and glanced starry-eyed at the old grand old flag. But little did we know that while we were celebrating the joy of liberation, the joy of emancipation, that the great liberator, the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln the Just, was being felled by an assassin's bullet at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C.
I'm here with Major Martin Delany. Major, I want to thank you for giving us time today out of your schedule. Appreciate you being here. I want to ask you a couple of questions, if we may. I know that you were born in Charlestown, Virginia. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and so about what period of time was that when you were born? Was that 18?
It was in the early 1800s. Actually, I was born May the 6th, 1812.
1812 in Charlestown. Could you tell us a little bit about your childhood there in Charlestown?
Being born in Charlestown afforded me an opportunity to grow up among all types of people. I lived on Lawrence Street. An interesting thing about Charlestown is that it is the community where the relatives and the family of George Washington came from. And so a lot of the streets and important places are named after Washington ancestors. And the street I was born on was named after one of his brothers, Lawrence.
So what did your parents do?
My mother and my grandmother, who I lived with as a young child, they were seamstress. My father was a slave. He did not live in Charlestown. He lived in nearby Martinsburg, and he was a carpenter.
Okay, so your father was a slave. Your mother was a free woman?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, what happened was that my grandfather, Shango, was a Mandingo prince, and he was pledged to be married to a young lady named Gracie. But before they were married, they were kidnapped and put on a slave ship and brought to America, and they landed at the port of Richmond, Virginia. But there were several ways in which a person could gain their freedom. And so Shango's master, finding out that he was of royalty, felt that if you were royal, it was ordained by God. And so it would not be right for a royal person to be a slave. And he gave Shango and Gracie their freedom. And in the state of Virginia, if your mother is free when you were born free, then you would be free. And so fortunately for me and my siblings, we were all born free because my mother was free.
Well, that had to be difficult for you and for your family to have your father not free, but your mother.
Yes, it was quite difficult because my father could only visit us on certain occasions, or would have to have a pass or whatever to visit with his family. And there was one occasion I remember when his master had threatened to punish him. And he would do anything his master asked him to do, but he refused to be beaten. And so he wrestled with his master, and during that occasion, his master went and got the sheriff to arrest him, and my father was hit in the head with a brick, and he bore that scar for the rest of his life. But anyway, due to this incident, he had to go to court, and we were all afraid that he might be put in prison or sent south, or sold in the South. But then his master, realizing how valuable he was as a carpenter to him, he made my father stand up in the courtroom and apologize to him. And upon the apology, he asked the judge if he would release him.
Well, now I know that you lived in Charlestown until you were what, probably 10 or
yeah, about
11,
10 years old,
like that.
Right.
So your family moved, and what was why did you move away from? Why did you move out of Virginia?
Well, actually, as I say, growing up on Lawrence Street, we grew up with all types of European immigrants from England, from Scotland, from Ireland, and so forth. And so I had a lot of little, playmates. And when my playmates came of age to go to school, my younger sister and I decided to follow them. But of course, being of color, we were not allowed to attend the school. and we used to sit out in front of the window and watch our playmates as they learned their lessons. And so then we used to trick our playmates into playing school after regular school was out, and that's how we even learned the lesson more. And so in doing this, the Delany children, that's how we actually begin learning to read. And in one instance, a peddler came by and saw us sitting out in front of the school, and he approached me and told me that he had a book that he could sell me or trade to my parents, that we could learn everything they were learning in the white school. And he was talking about the New York Primer for reading and spelling. And so he came by, and my mother, being a seamstress and grandmother being a seamstress, they traded him some material for the book. And he started out giving us reading lessons, and every time he would come to Charlestown, he would give us another lesson. But once it was discovered that the Delany children learned to read, my mother was threatened with prosecution. And so the banker, who was Mr. Brown, who was a good friend of the family, advised my mother to leave Charlestown, not to go to court, because she would be found guilty and we would probably be taken as orphans or sold off into slavery.
So it was against the law?
Yeah, it was against the law.
For you to learn to read?
Yeah, it was against the law for children of color to learn to read, right? So they were holding my mother responsible for teaching us, and therefore she was subject to prosecution. In fact, the constable came to our house and presented her with the summons to go to court. And then that's when she went to Mr. Brown, who she trusted, and he advised her. He said, whatever you do, Ms. Delany, don't go to that court hearing because you're going to be found guilty. But fortunately, my father had been working in getting extra work as a carpenter and receiving wages. And he used those wages and signed an agreement with his master to purchase his freedom. And in Charlestown, once you purchased, or in Virginia, once you purchased your freedom, you had 1 year to leave the state of Virginia or you would be put back into slavery. And so my mother had indicated to him where we were going, and not long after that, he had purchased his freedom, and he was able to join us in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania.
So you moved from Charlestown to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Right. How different did you find things, if at all? And I mean, how did your life change?
I life changed dramatically in Chambersburg. In Chambersburg, we were able to, well, first of all, Pennsylvania had already outlawed slavery, and also we were able to attend school without fear of persecution or prosecution. So those were two very positive things about Chambersburg. But ironically, my father, who was a carpenter, and my mother and grandmother, who were seamstress, were able to practice their craft as craftsmen or tradesmen in the slave state of Virginia. But in the free community of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, all of the crafts were reserved for the white European immigrants. And so my father was forced to give up carpentry and work in the coal yards or as a common laborer. And my mother could no longer practice as a seamstress, but had to work in a tavern scrubbing floors and scrubbing pots. So it's ironic that you could not get wages in Virginia, but at least you could learn a trade or a craft. In Pennsylvania, you could earn wages, but you couldn't get a trade or practice a craft.
What about schooling? Were you able? Did you go to school in Chambersburg?
Yeah, we went to school. As I say, that was one of the advantages, that we were able to go to school. But however, it was limited. So you could go to about the 6th grade. And so when I became about 18 years of age, I had asked my parents permission to leave home. And I wanted to go to Pittsburgh because I heard that in Pittsburgh there were greater opportunities for education. And upon arriving in Pittsburgh, I found that they had a school for colored gentlemen that was run by a Reverend Lewis Woodson. And so that enabled me to even further my education more.
Now, I understand that you attended Harvard Medical College. How did you go from Chambersburg to Pittsburgh and then end up being enrolled at Harvard Medical College?
Well, fortunately for me, there was a doctor, Dr. Andrew N. McDowell, in Chambersburg that had become a friend of our family. And Dr. McDowell had moved to Pittsburgh. And when I found out Dr. McDowell was in Pittsburgh, and me being a young person and new to the city, I was constantly, looking for a job or looking for work. And when I found out Dr. McDowell was there, one of the things I did was to do chores or work around his home or around his office. And so one day I was talking with Dr. McDowell, and he asked me what I would want to become. And I said, well, Dr. McDowell, I think I would like to be a doctor. And he said, you, a colored person? I said, yes. He said, well, you know what, Martin? You're bright enough to be a doctor. I tell you what, he said, you come here bright and early in the morning and I'll get you started. And so I would assist him on his calls. He would have me read his medical books and medical journals. And then he began teaching me how to sit broken bones, to do a practice that was common in that day called cupping and leeching and various. And so, and then he introduced me to Dr. Gazan and other doctors, and I began to do things and learn from them. And so these doctors wrote letters of recommendation to me to several medical schools, but because of my color, I was not admitted. So finally I said, well, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. At Harvard had the reputation of being an abolitionist. I said, certainly he would not deny me. And so when I showed him my letters of introduction, he said that I could enter the school if I would sign a pledge that two other students of color had signed, that after you finished your practice of medicine, you would not practice in the United States, but you would go to Africa. I refused to sign the pledge, but I was admitted to anyway. And so that is how I was able to attend Harvard Medical College.
Now, I understand you weren't allowed to complete your education there, is that correct?
Yes, well, you see, many of the students at the Harvard College had come from the Deep South. And they went to Dr. Holmes and with a petition and complained that they did not want their degrees tainted with the 3 black males and the 1 female student that was allowed to attend. And so we were not allowed, the 3 of us were not allowed to attend our final semester.
So you were essentially escorted from the school.
Correct. And I think I went back to Chambersburg and began just to continue studying medicine, apprenticing under Dr. McDowell and Dr. Gazan. I think one of my classmates, Snowden was his last name. I think he maybe transferred or went to maybe Amherst or some other college, and he did end up becoming a medical doctor in Africa, but I basically became a medical doctor. They had a yellow fever epidemic in Pittsburgh, and my work there I received great praise, and I began to pick up some of my own patients, and so it was through the apprenticeship under Dr. Gazan and Dr. McDowell that I was able to become a medical doctor.
Okay. Well, at this time I'd like to announce that you're not really Major Martin Delany. You're actually Joe Bundy of Bluefield, West Virginia, one of our History Lab presenters. And Joe, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone, and I've asked you this question on this very show before, what it was about this particular individual that inspired you. How did you come to, how were you introduced to Martin Delany, and how did you go about building up this character and researching him?
Well, actually, I think I'm typical of a lot of West Virginia people. We take great pride in our state. And whenever we find out that someone who's accomplished something or did something outstanding was from or born or lived in West Virginia, we sort of gravitate toward those people. Well, I had gone to a fraternity meeting in Ohio at Kent State University, and they had a room with an exhibit of outstanding black people in history. And they had their pictures on the wall, and one of the pictures had on there Martin Delany. Well, I was familiar with Delany as a South Carolina Reconstruction politician, but that was all that I had known about him. And it had on there he was born in Charleston, West Virginia. Well, seeing that made me want to find out more about him. But when I began to do research, I found out that they had actually made a mistake. And he was not born in Charleston, but he was born in Charlestown in the eastern panhandle. But I went to Bluefield State College and got a book that he had commissioned to me as a biography written by a woman named Frances Whipper. However, it was hard for a woman to be published in those days, and particularly a black woman. So she wrote under the pen name of a man, Frank S. Rollin, but she wrote this authorized biography of Delany called The Life and Public Service of Martin R. Delany. And that was the first book that I read about him, and I just became more fascinated with him, and I thought that he's just an outstanding character to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he is. I mean, he led a very diverse life, was into a lot of different things. He was he established a newspaper, what, in the 1840s, 50s?
Yes, in the late 1840s, he established an abolitionist newspaper called The Mystery. He was disappointed that many of the newspapers in the Pittsburgh area would only write about things that African Americans did if it was negative, if you were arrested for something or did something bad. And many of the good things they were doing in the community was being overlooked. And so he thought with his newspaper he could write about some of these things. And in addition, since he had become involved in the colored convention movement and the anti-slavery movement, he could also use it as an organ to write for the abolition of slavery.
Well, he was involved heavily in the Underground Railroad, for instance, and now
he was also an inventor.
Really?
Yeah, he invented what was called an inclined pulley, and this pulley was used to pull rail cars up hills or whatever. And so that in the transportation of cargo or freight, it was a very important invention. And so he went to Washington, D.C. to patent his invention, and found out that because he was a person of color and was not, therefore could not be an American citizen, he was not allowed to patent his invention. So that was one of the setbacks, another setback that he had in life.
Well, of course, one of his major achievements here in the last, we're down to our last minute or so here. You're wearing the uniform of an officer. He had a field command. Was he not the first officer of color?
Yes. Actually, when President Lincoln authorized the use of formation of the United States colored troops, he became a recruiter. But in recruiting the soldiers, that he found that the United States Army was having trouble finding white officers who would command them, because in some instances they would be looked down upon. And so he decided to take the bold move of going to the White House and speaking directly to President Abraham Lincoln about a plan he had where you could train black officers and use the secret routes of the Underground Railroad to have them go behind enemy lines and form troops. And President Lincoln liked his idea and asked him if he would take one of the commands, and that's how Delany became commissioned a major in the United States Army.
Yeah. Well, Joe Bundy, I want to thank you for being here with us today, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in and watching us on History Alive.